In the heart of West Africa, the Republic of Mali, a country once seen as a model of democratic progress in the region, experienced two sudden military coups within the span of just 9 months, between August 2020 and May 2021.
General Amadou Sanogo was arrested at his home in Mali's capital, Bamako. He's been charged with complicity in kidnapping. Soon after last year's coup, fighters linked to Al-Qaeda launched a rebellion in the north.
These weren't isolated incidents. They marked a dramatic reversal in Mali's political trajectory, dismantling a fragile civilian government and placing power firmly in the hands of the military. The first coup was justified by claims of government mismanagement, insecurity, and corruption. The second came under the guise of correcting the first, a coup within a coup. Together, these events did more than just disrupt domestic governance. They shook West Africa's political landscape, triggered sanctions and diplomatic standoffs, and opened the door to new geopolitical alignments, including the growing presence of foreign military actors like the Wagner Group from Russia. For a country already grappling with jihadist insurgencies, ethnic tensions, and economic hardship, the dual coups exposed deep institutional weaknesses and created a power vacuum with consequences that extended well beyond Mali's borders. This is the story of how one nation's democratic experiment was derailed and how its fate became a cautionary tale for an entire region. To understand the coup that took place in August 2020, we need to look at the political and social tensions that had been building for years. Mali's then president, Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta, commonly referred to as IBK, had been in power since 2013. Initially elected with broad support, his presidency was increasingly marred by widespread allegations of corruption, nepotism, economic mismanagement, and, most critically, a growing inability to address the country's worsening security crisis. Since 2012, Mali had been battling insurgencies in the north and center of the country, including jihadist groups linked to Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Despite international support, including French troops under Operation Barkhane and UN peacekeeping forces, large swaths of the country remained outside government control. Civilian casualties mounted, trust in the military declined, and displaced populations grew. By 2020, frustration had reached a breaking point. A coalition of opposition leaders, civil society groups, and religious figures known as the June 5th Movement, Rally of Patriotic Forces, M5 RFP, began organizing massive protests in Bamako, the capital. They called for President Keïta's resignation, accusing him of failing to lead, ignoring the people's demands, and presiding over a broken state. The protests gained momentum throughout the summer. Public anger intensified after controversial parliamentary elections in March and April 2020, which were plagued by irregularities and a constitutional court ruling that many viewed as rigged in favor of Keïta's allies. On August 18, 2020, the tension snapped. A group of Malian soldiers from the Kati military base just outside Bamako mutinied. Led by Colonel Assimi Goïta and other mid-ranking officers, they stormed the capital, arrested President Keïta, Prime Minister Bobo Cissé, and several other officials. Within hours, Keïta announced his resignation in a televised address, dissolving the government and the National Assembly. The coup was swift and largely bloodless. In its aftermath, the military formed the National Committee for the Salvation of the People, promising to oversee a political transition and restore civilian rule. The international response was mixed. While some Malian citizens welcomed the coup as a necessary reset, regional bodies like ECOWAS, the African Union, and Western governments condemned the power grab and demanded a return to constitutional order. Sanctions were imposed and negotiations began to establish a transitional government. In September 2020, under pressure from ECOWAS, the military appointed Ba Nada, a retired colonel and former defense minister, as interim president. Colonel Goïta was named vice president, and the transitional charter outlined an 18-month timeline to democratic elections. At the time, the move was cautiously welcomed as a compromise solution. But as the months passed, new tensions emerged within the transitional leadership, setting the stage for yet another power struggle. By early 2021, hopes for a smooth transition to civilian rule in Mali were already beginning to fade. The transitional government formed after the August 2020 coup was supposed to serve as a bridge, a compromise between the military and civilian stakeholders tasked with guiding the country toward democratic elections by early 2022. At the top of that arrangement were interim President Ba Nada and Prime Minister Mokhtar Wane, both civilians with military backgrounds chosen in part to appease both international partners and domestic critics. But behind the scenes, power remained concentrated in the hands of the military, particularly Vice President Colonel Assimi Goïta, the same officer who had led the original coup. Over the following months, tensions began to grow between the civilian leadership and the military figures still embedded in key ministries. Disagreements emerged over appointments, reforms, and especially over how to handle the electoral timeline. The transitional government also struggled to address Mali's worsening insecurity and economic crisis, causing further public disillusionment. The breaking point came in May 2021. On May 24th, in a surprise move, President Nada and Prime Minister Wane announced a cabinet reshuffle. Several key military officials were reassigned or removed from their post, reportedly without consulting Goïta or other members of the military leadership. Hours later, the military struck again. President Nada and Prime Minister Wane were detained by the army and taken to the Kati military base, the same location used during the August 2020 coup. Within days, Colonel Goïta declared that the president and prime minister had attempted to sabotage the transition and stated that he had no choice but to remove them. On May 28, 2021, Mali's constitutional court confirmed Goïta as the new interim president, effectively legitimizing the second coup within 9 months. A new civilian prime minister, Choguel Maïga, was appointed soon after, though power clearly remained in the hands of the military. The response from the international community was swift. ECOWAS and the African Union suspended Mali from their organizations. France temporarily halted joint military operations, and diplomatic tensions rose between Bamako and Paris. The United Nations and several Western governments condemned the coup and called for the restoration of civilian leadership and respect for the transitional timetable. But within Mali, reactions were more complex. Some segments of the population viewed Goïta's takeover as necessary to restore order and complete the transition. Others saw it as a troubling consolidation of military power, a transition in name only. The second coup confirmed what many had feared. The military had no intention of being sidelined. Instead, it had simply shifted from behind-the-scenes influence to full control, reshaping Mali's future on its own terms. As the dust settled in mid-2021, the transitional roadmap was rewritten once again, and with it, the fate of Mali's fragile democracy hung in the balance. Mali's 2 coups in less than a year sent shockwaves not just across West Africa, but throughout the entire international community. For regional bodies like ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, and the African Union, the back-to-back military takeovers presented a serious challenge. These organizations had been working for decades to strengthen democratic governance and stability across the continent. Mali, once viewed as a model for peaceful democratic transitions, now became a troubling symbol of political backsliding. Immediately following both coups, ECOWAS imposed diplomatic and economic sanctions, including border closures and the suspension of financial aid. The bloc demanded a clear, credible path back to civilian rule and insisted on a firm electoral timeline. The African Union followed suit, suspending Mali's membership and condemning the military's consolidation of power. But the impacts of the coups weren't limited to diplomatic circles. Mali plays a central role in regional security efforts, particularly in the fight against jihadist insurgencies in the Sahel, a vast region plagued by extremist violence. The country has been a staging ground for international counter-terrorism operations, including Operation Barkhane, France's major military campaign against armed Islamist groups in the region, the G5 Sahel Joint Force, which includes troops from Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Chad, and Mauritania, the United Nations Multidimensional Integrated Stabilization Mission in Mali, or MINUSMA, a peacekeeping mission with thousands of personnel. Following the second coup in 2021, many of Mali's international partners reassessed their engagement. France froze joint military operations with Malian forces, citing concerns about governance and accountability. The European Union suspended training programs for the Malian army. The United States and other donors reviewed their aid packages, concerned about human rights and political legitimacy. At the same time, Mali's government, now under full military control, began to pivot its foreign policy. Relations with France, once Mali's key security partner, deteriorated rapidly. Amid rising anti-French sentiment in Bamako and growing frustration with foreign intervention, the military leadership sought alternative alliances, including closer ties with Russia. This shift culminated in reports of cooperation with the Wagner Group, a Russian paramilitary organization known for operating in conflict zones across Africa and the Middle East. The Malian government has neither confirmed nor denied these ties, but the alleged presence of Wagner forces has raised alarms among Western governments, who see it as a sign of growing Russian influence in the Sahel. In response, France announced the withdrawal of its forces from Mali in 2022, marking a major turning point in the region's security landscape. These changes have left a power vacuum and raised critical questions. Can Mali maintain its internal security without foreign support? Will new partnerships provide stability or invite further volatility? And what does this mean for neighboring countries facing similar threats? What began as a domestic political crisis has become a regional dilemma, affecting counterterrorism efforts, humanitarian programs, and the future of democratic governance across West Africa. While the political and diplomatic consequences of Mali's back-to-back coups were substantial, the domestic impact on ordinary Malians has been even more profound. Following the 2020 and 2021 coups, Mali's economy, already fragile, faced increased uncertainty, reduced investment, and a decline in international aid. ECOWAS sanctions and the suspension of budgetary support from international partners placed immediate strain on government finances, slowing development programs and limiting the state's ability to deliver public services. Mali is one of the world's poorest countries, with much of its population reliant on agriculture, informal trade, and subsistence work. Political instability further discouraged private investment and disrupted cross-border commerce, particularly with neighboring ECOWAS states. Sanctions imposed after the coup delayed infrastructure projects and led to inflationary pressures, making daily necessities more expensive for millions. Unemployment remained high, especially among youth, who are among the most vulnerable to political unrest and radicalization. The government also struggled to access international loans and grants, relying more heavily on domestic revenue and politically motivated partnerships, including with non-traditional allies like Russia. The coup also led to a sharp contraction of political space and civil liberties. While the military promised to safeguard national interest, critics and opposition figures began facing growing restrictions. Journalists and media outlets reporting on government actions encountered censorship and intimidation. Civil society organizations were sidelined from meaningful participation in the transitional process. Anti-government protests were occasionally suppressed, and political parties found themselves in a weakened position under military oversight. The post-coup environment shifted from democratic dialogue to controlled messaging, with the military seeking to consolidate legitimacy without formal elections. Internally, the military's expanded role in politics did not automatically translate into improved national security. Extremist violence continued in the north and center of the country, often targeting civilians, security forces, and humanitarian workers. Attacks by groups linked to Al-Qaeda and ISIS persisted. Entire communities have been displaced, and thousands of schools and health facilities remain non-functional due to insecurity. The withdrawal of French forces and reduction in international support has left Malian forces stretched thin. While the government has looked to alternative security providers, including private military contractors, this has not led to a substantial or sustainable improvement in safety. For many Malians, daily life remains shaped by insecurity, poverty, and political exclusion, a stark contrast to the promises made by the military following each coup. Perhaps the most lasting effect of the coup has been the erosion of public trust in democratic governance. Years of corruption, ineffective leadership, and delayed reforms disillusioned many Malians. But the replacement of flawed civilian rule with opaque military governance has not resolved the core issues, it's only transformed them. While some segments of the population continue to support the military government for its nationalistic rhetoric and anti-foreign stance, many others see a longer road ahead to rebuild democratic institutions and ensure accountable leadership. As of 2025, Mali stands at a critical crossroads. The military-led transitional government, headed by Colonel Assimi Goïta, remains in control. While it initially pledged to restore democratic rule within a defined timeline, that timeline has been repeatedly extended. The most recent roadmap suggests elections may be held in 2026, but confidence in the process remains uncertain and deeply divided. For many Malians, there is a growing fatigue, not just with political elites, but with promises of reform that have yet to materialize. Citizens have lived through instability, insecurity, and economic hardship for over a decade, and public trust in institutions, military or civilian, has eroded. A return to democratic governance is still possible, but it depends on several key factors: credible and transparent elections, organized in consultation with civil society, political parties, and regional partners, a genuine transition of power, not just a reshuffling of military actors into civilian roles, security sector reform, ensuring that the armed forces serve under elected authority, not the other way around. International actors continue to pressure Mali for democratic progress, but their influence has waned in recent years, particularly as Bamako distances itself from former partners like France and aligns more closely with non-Western powers. Mali's foreign policy has shifted significantly. Frustrated with international criticism and conditional aid, the transitional government has pivoted toward Russia, China, and other partners that emphasize non-interference and security cooperation over democratic accountability. This realignment has major implications for West Africa and the broader Sahel. Mali's choices are being watched closely by neighbors such as Burkina Faso and Niger, which have also seen recent coups and rising military influence. If Mali succeeds in establishing security and economic growth under military rule, it could encourage similar models elsewhere. If it fails, it may reinforce the dangers of abandoning democratic principles without a viable alternative. Despite the uncertainty, Mali's future ultimately depends on its people. Civil society remains active even under restrictions. Youth movements, religious leaders, women's groups, and grassroots activists continue to advocate for inclusive governance, human rights, and lasting peace. There's still space, however limited, for civic engagement, dialogue, and resilience. The challenge is to ensure that these voices are not silenced or sidelined as Mali navigates its most precarious political chapter in decades. The dual coups of 2020 and 2021 reshaped Mali's political reality, but they didn't erase the root problems that led to them: weak institutions, elite corruption, regional inequalities, and chronic insecurity. Whether the current leadership can address these challenges or merely perpetuate them remains to be seen. One thing is clear: Mali's story is far from over. Mali's back-to-back coups in 2020 and 2021 were not just political upheavals, they were moments that exposed the fault lines of a fragile democracy. They revealed deep-seated frustrations with corruption, insecurity, and ineffective governance, but they also raised difficult questions about the alternatives. Can military rulers deliver what elected leaders could not? And at what cost to civil liberties, democratic norms, and national unity? Today, Mali is still in transition, not just from military to civilian rule, but from uncertainty to clarity about its identity, its priorities, and its place in the world. It is a nation caught between competing visions of leadership, between international pressure and local agency, and between hope for change and fear of repetition. The story of Mali's coups is still being written. Whether it ends with renewed democracy or deeper authoritarianism will depend not just on generals or foreign powers, but on the resolve of Mali's citizens to demand, defend, and define their own future. Because in the end, the real power shift won't come from a coup. It will come from the people. If you found this story eye-opening, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell.